Welcome back to our class on spiritual beings. This is not how I envisioned this class to go. I thought we would be back together in the gym and we would continue to work through this study. I hope this is blessing you. And so, what I wanted to do, because of this quarantine situation, a lot of you guys have heard, we've kind of had a COVID outbreak in the office. A few of us are sick. So, I thought we would do a video class and go back and pick up a topic that I got a lot of questions about. And so one topic that I got many questions about is this idea of Eden being a type of temple. Envision, Eden being up on a mountain, and that would be where God's space and our space interlocked and intertwined. And that seems strange to some people, and rightfully so. Maybe you've never thought about that before. So I want to show from the Bible and use some visuals tonight. What I'd love to do is show you some pictures that illustrate this point and start to build kind of a mental map for what the Bible's trying to say. So this spiritual being study, this is a really important component of it, is what was the Garden of Eden? Was the Garden of Eden a place where man, in his physicality, man and woman, as human beings made from the dust of the ground, had face-to-face interaction with spiritual beings? And if that's the case, then the idea of God appearing in the cool of the day and strolling through the garden and having fellowship with man, and this idea of cherubim showing up and this Nahash, this possible nefarious spiritual being, Satan, those beings being there in the first place in the garden wouldn't be so strange if we understood that this is a place where the spiritual realm and the physical realm came together there at Eden. So my prayer is by the end of this study, that will make a lot of sense. And maybe you'll be convinced, I hope, that that's what the Bible's trying to say. So let's move ahead with our study and let's talk about this idea of Eden being this temple. And the first thing I want you to see is the mountain of Eden. Eden was on a mountain. We've talked about this in the first week of classes that we had. So one thing you'll notice is that people meet God on mountains. And just take for a second and just maybe think through some places in Scripture where you can remember where big things happened on a mountain. You probably can think of a lot really quick. You can think of Mount Sinai. You can think of Mount Hermon. You can think of Mount Carmel. You can think of the Mount of Transfiguration. You can think of the Sermon on the Mount. Over and over again, we see great things happening on mountains. Particularly, we see God meeting with man on mountains. And that goes right back to the Garden of Eden. The garden, I believe, and I think the Bible makes it clear, was on a mountain. Now, when we think about this idea, it just makes sense that rivers flowed from Eden. So these rivers originated from Eden and went into the wilderness. And typically, rivers begin in high places and flow to low places. So that's what we see in the Bible. Also, Eden is compared to other mountains in Scripture. It's just assumed, like it's insider information, that Eden was on a mountain. So in Joel chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, it says, "Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm on my holy mountain. Before them, the land is like the Garden of Eden, behind them a desert wasteland." So in Joel chapter 2, we have this idea of Eden being on a holy mountain, in Zion. So all these are being compared to one another. In Ezekiel 28, we see, and we looked at this one time in one class in particular for a long time, Eden being the garden of God. So it just comes out and calls Eden the garden of God, the holy mountain of God in Ezekiel 28. So there's just an assumption that Eden was a mountain. So let's just talk for a second. So I think that's easy to understand, that the Bible makes it clear that Eden was on a high place, that Eden was on a mountain. So that's not a very difficult topic to grasp. But this next point is a little bit harder for people. And it's this idea that Eden is the place where heaven and earth overlap, that we have God's space and our space coming together. So when people hear ministers speak of Eden as a place where heaven and earth overlap, it seems to be confusing. And people think, now, wait a minute. I thought heaven was up there. Heaven is a distinct, different place. So we have our space, which is here on earth, and God has his space. And so heaven is like way up past Jupiter somewhere. And so we use this spatial language to describe heaven and earth. And really it's not helpful. Maybe it would be better to think of heaven as another dimension. And that's not hard for us living in the modern world, because we know from physics that there are other dimensions and they are real. And Science pretty much accepts that. So there's this idea that there is extra dimensionality. There are other dimensions out there. So there's God's space and there's our space. There's God's dimension and our dimension. So when we look at the biblical evidence for its description of Eden, we find a place where these two dimensions overlap. So that's what we're seeing, the overlapping of two different dimensions. So Psalm 8 talks about this calling of man, what we're called to be. Psalm 8 is about creation. So the psalmist says, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you've ordained, what is man? Literally here, man is human. What is human? That you take thought of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him. Now listen to this part. Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings. Literally, the Elohim. Remember, we had the whole class on Elohim, just as a general term for spiritual beings. So we were made, like, think about it, we were made from dirt, we were made from dust. We were made a little bit lower than these Elohim. But you crowned him, talking of man, with glory and majesty. You make him to rule over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet. So even though we were made a little bit lower than the Elohim, we have been elevated. We've been given a place in this creation to rule. And my contention is that rule was to have it happen from the Garden of Eden. The garden was one part of Eden. So there's the general space of Eden. Then there's the special place called the Garden of Eden. So from the garden, man would be part of God's divine assembly, his council. And man would be taught and become wise and would take God's rule into the howling wilderness. And man would bring the garden out into the rest of Eden, would gardenize the world. So there was this dominion mandate. And so all that was happening there at Eden, where God's space was connected with our space. And we had access to God's wisdom, and we could walk with God and see him face to face. That's what Psalm 8's talking about. So let's just think about, as we build this kind of mental map of Eden being like a temple. I want you to think about that for just a minute. I want you to consider Eden being a temple, and not just any temple, but the temple of God. Think of the tabernacle and temple of the Bible. And the tabernacle and the temple of the Bible had zones of holiness. Think of, as you got closer to the center place of the holiness, things got to be very dangerous. I always tell people to think of holiness as like the sun. You know, the sun is so important. Its radiance and its glory and its power is so important. We got to have it to live and to survive. But if you get too close to the sun, you will burn up because of its glory and its majesty. Holiness is just like this. As you move closer and closer to being with God in his presence, it gets to be a dangerous thing. So in Eden, we had these zones of holiness and presence. Now, we didn't have to be worried about that because we didn't have the sin problem. We could see God. We could be with God. So consider the wilderness outside of Eden. So there's one zone. And I've got a diagram here for you to look at here on the screen. So there's the howling wilderness outside of Eden. Then there's the land of Eden, and then there's the Garden of Eden. And as we move closer to the garden, we're working to places of holiness or more presence of God. So once you get to the garden in the high place of Eden, God's temple, so to speak, you find the tree of life. You find the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And you have God meeting Adam and Eve face to face right there. So it's kind of cool how that works out. And you'll notice a trend that's very similar to what you see with the tabernacle. So here's the tabernacle. Think of the tabernacle and the zones of holiness. There's the camp of Israel, so the outlying camp where the people lived. Then there's the tabernacle itself, the tabernacle proper, the building itself. Then you have the Holy of Holies, the very centerpiece, the very hot spot of God's presence. And that's where God met man over the cherubim at the Ark of the Covenant. You're going to notice some really cool stuff as we start to work through this study and connections between Eden and the Garden of God. So I hope those zones of holiness make sense to you now, that you think, okay, I can start to grasp that Eden was a type of temple and that there were zones of holiness just like you'd find in the tabernacle. And here's the thing also that blows people's mind. The tabernacle and the temple of Israel were to be mini Edens. They're like miniature Edens on earth. They're actually symbolic pictures of Eden. When you look at the description of the tabernacle and temple and how they were furnished, you will notice that they're copies of Eden on earth. So that's pretty neat to think about. So let's think of Eden as the mountain temple. Okay, so a mountain temple, and Eden being that temple. So when you visualize the Garden of Eden, we would visualize a mountain temple where God met Adam and Eve. So start to kind of build that picture in your head. There's the general land of Eden, and then there's the special area of the garden. When one starts to consider this concept of Eden being a garden sanctuary, things start to fall into place. So parts of the Bible are going to really start making sense to you, like this. Why did rebellious people build the Tower of Babel? What's the purpose of building this tower that's going to reach up to heaven? So think about that for just a minute. Excuse me for a second. What about Mount Sinai and the giving of the law? Think about that. It's on a mountain where God meets his people. And what about the permanent temple being on Mount Zion? Now think about that for a second. So all these questions should start to kind of make sense of when you consider that Eden was a mountain temple. Here's a picture. I know this is like a cartoon, but this comes from the Bible Project, and they have some really good artistry in their videos. But this is one of the slides that they put out for their series on this very topic. And so you see an artist rendition of a mountaintop garden. You see the rivers are coming from Eden there, going downward from the mountain. So Eden on a mountain there in this picture. I'm going to show you another one that's really cool. Now in this picture, notice God's throne, the kind of bluish, light blue part of the picture will be God's throne. And notice that the Eden is on top of the mountain there. So God's throne and God's space is kind of interlocking with Eden. So I thought this picture would kind of help you build a mental map, a picture of what we're talking about. So in that one place where you have these circles coming together, this place of commonality where God's temple and throne, or God's dwelling and throne, comes to dwell right there on the mountain at Eden. Now here's something that's really cool about the tabernacle and the temple. The Ark of the Covenant was considered to be the footstool of God's throne. So how Israel visualized, like Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, when they would go into the Holy of Holies that one time of the year, the high priest would go in and sprinkle blood all over the Holy of Holies. And it was understood that God was dwelling right above the cherubim there, right above the Ark of the Covenant. That in essence, this throne that you're seeing right now in this picture was there. And God's footstool was the Ark of the Covenant. So that's the visualization that you need to get. So hopefully these pictures are helping a little bit. I hope you don't think these are silly and childish, but I do think seeing these things, this artwork helps a little bit. Now, here's a classic picture of the Tower of Babel. Of course, this Tower of Babel here is more of a modernized view of what it would probably be more like a ziggurat, but this is kind of a classical picture you see in classical Western art of the Tower of Babel. But here's the thing. This tower is reaching to the heavens. And at the very top of this tower would be a temple. That's how the Babylonians built temples. Now, Babel is the same word we get later for the Babylonians or Babylon. So it's the same word. So don't let that confuse you. So think of a Babylonian ziggurat where you have this staged tower, with a wide base at the bottom that works its way up and gets smaller at the top. But at the very top of these ziggurats, these temple mountains, is they would have a temple at the very top. And so think about what the Babylonians were trying to do. I believe there was this echo of a voice of, hey, God's dwelling at one time was on this mountain. God had a mountain temple. And so the Tower of Babel was an attempt to get back to Eden. And they know they couldn't go back because of the flaming cherubim that were posted at the entrance of the garden. Man couldn't go back that way. So Babel was an attempt to get back to God's space, so to speak. Wrong way to do it. And there's also some irony in that story. In the account to the Tower of Babel, the people say, let us make a Shem for ourselves. Let us make a name for ourselves in Hebrew. And the person of promise was actually Shem, the Shemites. That would be the Semites, the Jews. So they're going to make a name for themselves instead of following God's plan and God's person of promise. But maybe this visual of the Tower of Babel helps a little bit. So you start to see, okay, this is why they're building these structures. These ancients are trying to build a garden temple on a mountain. That's what they're trying to accomplish. Now here's Mount Sinai. Here's a diagram of Mount Sinai. And maybe this will make some sense as you look at this picture now. Okay, Mount Sinai, this is where Moses receives the law, right? God meets them on the mountaintop. So in that thick cloud with the thunder and lightning, that's where God's presence is. So notice God's space is coming on top of the mountain of Sinai, just like it would have been in Eden. So this is not so good because of the sinfulness of the people. They can't go into God's presence or they will die. But as you approach the mountain, you go from zones of profane, like the nations, the unclean nations, then there around the foot of the mountain would be the nation of Israel. Then as you get to the mountain itself, you have the holy place, like the tabernacle proper. If you touch it, you die. But up in the cloud at the very top, the Acropolis of the mountain, the very peak of the mountain, you have the most holy place where God dwells. So maybe this picture helps a little bit too, as we start to build these mental pictures of what Eden was all about. And then here's a picture of the tabernacle. You get the same idea. You know, out in a minute ago, or a few minutes ago, I showed you those concentric circles of holiness. Here's another diagram displaying the same thing. You have, as you come toward the holy place, you go from zones of holiness, or clean or unclean and profane. Just another way to look at it. So there's another visual of how this works with the tabernacle. Now, let's just talk about evidence from the Bible that Eden is a temple. Where's the evidence? Where does it come from? So let's walk through this. Well, there's one guy that I would greatly recommend to you. If you're into this and you think this is really neat, G.K. Bill is a guy that did a lot of research, wrote a book about this, writes a lot of commentaries, is a very famous Bible scholar. And he's the one that, I mean, this stuff's always been around, but he kind of crystallizes all these connections between the idea of the temple and the Garden of Eden. So he says, just as the temple is a place of God's unique presence experienced by the priest, so Eden was a place where God walked with Adam. Think about it. Now, if you get into Hebrew verbal forms, you know, you probably could care less about the hitpael verb form, but people that understand Hebrew see there is a connection in the verbal form. When God is walking back and forth in the garden, it's the same language used to describe God's presence in the tabernacle. So the Bible's telling you something in the ancient Hebrew. Just as God walked back and forth in Eden, he is present in the tabernacle. Adam is also depicted as a priest with respect to his task, namely to work, to avad the temple garden, and to keep shamar, the garden. So he's to work, avad and shamar, to keep, and those are both priestly words. These are words that were used for the priesthood in Israel. As they ministered in the temple. And there's some passages, if you want to pause, you can go and look those up if you want to and see for yourself. Now up top, there's, I didn't tell you this, as you look at the passage in that first bullet point, you see Leviticus 26:12, Deuteronomy 23:14, 23:15. Don't worry about that. That's just in the Masoretic text. You'd want to look 23:15 up in your Bible. That's all that's in your English translation. Here's some other pieces of evidence. The cherubim assumed Adam's function to guard the tree of life, which became memorialized in the tabernacle. So remember, Adam was supposed to guard and keep the garden and the tree of life, but he abdicated that responsibility because he gave in to the snake. And so now the cherubim guard it, and when you go into the tabernacle, guess what's guarding the Ark of the Covenant? What is over the Ark of the Covenant? Cherubim. What's on the tapestry as you walk into the temple? The cherubim. So you have the same picture. The tree of life was probably a model of the lampstand. So the menorah lampstand that looked like a tree in the tabernacle was modeled off of the tree of life. Israel's tabernacle and temple had wood carvings that made it look like a garden. You had this jungle-like ambiance going on where it was like this lush garden area. So that's how the tabernacle was set up to look like the garden. And then just as the entrance to Israel's later temple was to face east and be on a mountain, so the entrance to Eden faced east and was situated on a mountain. Now this is just too much to be a coincidence when you start to really see these pieces fall together. So you've got this eastward movement. You're going to enter Eden from the east. You're going to enter the tabernacle or temple from the east. It's really important. They are both on mountains. The ark contained the law, in the Holy of Holies, and it echoed the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is both lead to wisdom. Now, someone would go, now wait a minute. Adam and Eve were not supposed to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That did not mean it was going to be that way forever. Most people believe there was going to be a time of maturation for Adam and Eve, and eventually God would have shared that with them, because all those trees were made for food for them, all of them. So that command was probably a temporary command for there to be some sense of maturation that would occur. Just as the holy or the temple had a tripartite structure of concentric circles of holiness, remember I showed you that in the diagram, the Holy of Holies, the holy place, and the courtyard. So the Garden of Eden had the same, Eden, the garden, and the outer world. So you have this tripartite holiness zones that you find in both places. And Ezekiel 28:13-14 refers to Eden. It just comes out and says it, the holy mountain of God. And everywhere else in the Old Testament where you find the holy mountain of God, it is referring to the temple or the tabernacle. So that phrase, holy mountain of God, is a direct connection linguistically to the temple and the tabernacle. And that is so important. So I hope you're convinced by now. I hope I don't have to do any more convincing. I hope you get it that, okay, Eden is a temple. Eden is where God's space interlocked and intertwined with man's space. So let's look at some more diagrams and pictures. Here is from the ESV Study Bible. I love my ESV Study Bible. I really enjoy the notes that's in it. And this is one diagram that's in this ESV Study Bible that's excellent. It's a picture of the temple, and I want you to realize if you're outside the temple, you'll notice the altar to the right. So let's just imagine we're going to walk into the temple, which we would not be allowed to do, but let's just say we were able to. And to the right, you see as we're walking in through the courtyard here, you'll see the altar, the burnt offerings would be offered. So that's where all the sacrifices would occur. To the left is the golden laver, or what's called the sea. And that's where ritual washings would take place for the priest. And then you walk through, you notice the humongous doors, and you've got the columns that look like plant-like structures, don't they? Notice the engravings of the palm trees and other things on the walls. You see cherubim creatures. You see lampstands that look like trees. You're getting the picture. This is a garden-like structure. And then notice as you climb up the steps and you go toward the Holy of Holies, that little cube right there in the back toward the back of the temple, you see two giant cherubim guarding the very presence of God. So guarding over what we would consider to be the tree of life, right? So that's what's happening here in the temple. And I hope this is kind of a neat picture. I love this diagram, but I'm a diagram fanatic. I love these things. I'm a visual kind of person, but I like this stuff. I hope you do too. But there's the picture once again from the ESV Study Bible. I love the fact that the columns have names in the temple. You've got these columns are named Jachin and Boaz. Some of you might have been to Boaz, Alabama, and I think that's where the name of the city came from. Back in the day, people went to the outlets in Boaz. Here's a picture, a rendition of Adam and Eve being expelled from the garden. Notice you got the flaming sword. You've got the cherubim guarding the garden. There, you may think, well, wait a minute, they don't look like animal creatures here. They're more humanoid looking, but this is just an artistic depiction of the way back to the garden is being guarded now. Now, some scholars have noticed in the sacrificial system of Israel, you have this sense of going back to Eden would be through the sword, the flaming sword. So you would have to cut the animal up with a sword and you would burn the animal up. So you have this burning sword, so to speak. And that's what the sacrifices are all about. And the cherubim over the ark is you would take the blood of the victim and sprinkle it over there to go into God's presence. So you have this connection maybe with the sacrificial system of Israel, and this flaming sword of the cherubim going back into God's presence required someone had to go through the flaming sword. And Jesus will be the one eventually that will go, the sword will fall upon him. Now we know he was crucified, but metaphorically, Jesus uses the prophecy from Zechariah and talks about the shepherd being stricken, that whole idea of being stricken with the sword, even though it was a metaphor for his death on the cross. But here's another picture. Some of these diagrams are kind of silly, but this is from Hendrickson's books. A book that has full of all kinds of diagrams and pictures. But here's a scan of that, and you've got the cherubim up top are kind of comical looking. But you've got the Garden of Eden up top. You see the rivers running from the garden, originating there. At the very peak there, you have the presence of God, the tree of life, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And you have the flaming sword and the cherubim blocking the way. And so you have that the falls, the exiles are moving eastward. To return back to the garden, you would return from the east and travel west. So think directionally there. That'll help. And then you've got the tabernacle at the bottom. And look what's guarding the very entrance of the tabernacle on the tapestry. You've got the cherubim. You also have the cherubim over the Ark of the Covenant. You have cherubim on other parts of tapestry. You've got the lampstand, which would look a lot like the trees, right? So you see the picture here. And then atonement is a return westward. We return from the east into the temple to approach God's presence again. So this was how man would return back to the presence of God. We were exiled. We were driven eastward. And so now in the tabernacle, in the temple, we would travel westward to get back to God's presence. Really neat stuff here. I hope this is helping. So tonight's class is all about going back to that study in particular and really filling in some gaps on Eden being a place where God was present, where God's space interlocked with our space, where spiritual beings were present along with Adam and Eve. And there's a day coming at the end of time when it's all said and done, after final judgment, the new heavens, the new earth, heaven. The Bible uses a lot of ways to describe it. But our final existence after our resurrected state, when we've received our new resurrected bodies, we will have fellowship with God. We will see him face to face, and we will be around spiritual beings just like it was in the beginning. So in essence, the Bible is driving back to Eden, but it's better than Eden. Think that Eden was incomplete. If you were there Sunday in my sermon, I talked a little bit about the creation of man was incomplete when you looked at the verbiage found there in Genesis chapter 1, starting around verse 24 and 25, 26, and 27. You have this imperfect idea of man's creation. And so the creation of man really was not completed until Jesus died on the cross. When he says in John's gospel, when he says, "It is finished," tetelestai. So this idea of redemption. So there was still something lacking, so to speak. Not that we were sinful, but something was not completed until the work of Christ. Christ was always in God's plan. So think of it that way. Christ wasn't like plan B. He was plan A all along. And so this new heavens, this new earth, this new existence in the future will be like a return to Eden, but better, a lot better. So hopefully this has helped you. I hope this has connected some dots for you and filled in some missing material. Tonight I'm probably not on my A game, so just bear with me. But I wanted to get through this so we didn't get behind. And I'm glad you're able to watch this. I'm sorry we're not together. I've enjoyed so much us being back together face to face, but this is just temporary. We're just talking about just a few days. This Wednesday, Sunday, and next Wednesday we'll be doing virtual, and then we'll be right back. And I think things are picking up with numbers with COVID. Things are about to get a lot better for us. So better days are looking ahead for us at Westgate and for God's people. Hope you have a great night, and thank you for watching this.